Hey, it's me, your boy Blue Gets again, and today we'll be doing a Yu-Gi-Oh! Tier analysis video, and we'll be doing it on Batteryman and Evols. So let's get started. First off, we're doing Batteryman. For the pros, this deck can OTK, they can swarm, they have decent spells and traps, and Time Rendering Morganite is a card that exists. Now on to the cons. It is Time Rendering Morganite or bust the deck. If you don't get your Time Rendering Morganite immediately, you're gonna have a hard time, and even if you do get it, you also have to hope that you, one, draw the cards you need, and two, you also have to hope that you survive the next turn for that card to pay off. Also, this deck is OTK or bust because it's somewhat of a glass cannon. This deck doesn't really have much defense to work with, so if you're not OTKing your opponent or whittling down their life points as well as their board with your Batteryman cards, you're kind of shit out of luck. This deck isn't too consistent because they only have like one searcher, and that's in the form of 9 Volt. Unless you count that Thunder Seahorse card. But I think that card prevents you from special summoning the turn you use its effect. All I know is it has some weird drawback that makes it almost unplayable. Also, another thing about this deck's consistency is they don't really have a generic searcher. Like, I guess like in the form of Fossil Dig or Rhoda or any of that type of stuff. In fact, Thunder Monsters don't really have that many support cards to work with. So it kind of hurts this deck's consistency even more. Plus, we haven't gotten any support for this deck in I guess since the beginning of Natural 4. This deck can't really play through too many negates, because this deck, like I mentioned, is like an OTK or bust. So basically, it's like a glass cannon-esque type of deck. Also, this deck loses to graveyard manipulation because a lot of your plays are going to be on the graveyard. The most common play would be using your Solar to dump your 9 Vault, and then using one of the many Monster Reborns this deck has to special summon your 9 Vault. If your opponent is DD Crowing you, I guess like the thing about DD Crow Called by the Grave, your one that battery, that one of your Monster Reborns, they don't target, so you just have to hope that your opponent doesn't snipe the card you need. Anyways, graveyard manipulation can actually hurt this deck quite a bit. If your opponent has like a card like Macro Cosmo or like Necro Valley, or they manage to snipe the cards you want to summon or you need in your graveyard, like with things like DD Crow, Called by, the many cards in the game that actually gets rid of graveyard presence, those things can actually give you even more of a hard time. Also, this deck is pretty slow, like I mentioned. Even if you get your Time Rendering Morganite, you have to wait turns for it to pay off. Also, even if you don't get it, you still need to wait turns for it to pay off and hope that you don't get bodied. Because the duels I've actually done with Batterymen, it was just me constantly top decking, hoping I actually get back into the game after my attempted OTK either fails or if my opponent is able to make it so I can't really put my OTK on the board. So it's like, yeah, this deck is a bit of a slow starter, but hopefully Konami gives this deck more support. Hopefully their own searcher that isn't 9 Volt. Please, Konami. Anyways, for the stats, I'd give this deck a 3 out of 5 in power, a 1.5 out of 5 in defense, a 2 out of 5 in recovery, a 2.5 out of 5 in versatility, and a 2 out of 5 in consistency. Overall, I'd say that this deck is a tier 3.5 deck. It's not absolutely abysmal, but it is pretty bad, and even bad for casuals. Next, we have Evols. And Evols, they just recently got support. The support is pretty good, but I still don't think it's enough to actually fix this deck's inherent problems. So let's go over it. For the pros, they have good monsters. Their evil tiles are good, and their evil swords are good, or at least the ones that most of you are going to be playing. They have great spells and traps, one of which is a search, and the other which allows you to special summon monsters from your deck, but obviously not for free. This deck can set up a few disruptions. If you manage to summon two of your Evols monsters out on the first turn, you're gonna be in for you're gonna be in for a good time. Also, this deck can work with generic Dino support, especially if you're one of the people who want to play the evolution pill, just so you can summon your ultimate conductor along with this deck, which works. Also, this deck is fairly consistent because with the new evil sword that is just really good. You can search it with your fossil dig, you can search it with your Evo diversity, and you could also just have it in your hand or use that one level one whose name I forgot. That allows you to basically just tribute it, but I dislike that card because of its heavy cost. Anyways, for the cons. They lack level modulation because as it should be obvious, this is actually an Xyz based deck. And the evil swords, with the exception of like 2 or 3, are all level 4 monsters. They're level 4, and then you have like 2 or 3 that are level 6. But the evil swords aren't the only things in the main deck, because the evil swords, they basically trigger their effect by working with the evil tiles. And the problem with the evil tiles are they're not the same level. They're generally going to be, their levels are going to be lower than 4, which is actually pretty annoying and frustrating. For those who remember my Yu-Gi-Oh tier analysis video on Fire Fist, you should get where I'm coming from with this. You basically need your evil tiles and evil swords just to do basic things in the deck. If you open with too much of one, you're going to be in for a really horrible time. Granted, the new evil sword kind of alleviates that problem a bit because you're able to send it from the deck to the graveyard, but that's another thing that's a problem with this deck. You have to link summon in order to make the most out of the new support, as well as make the most out of Singularity. Because, like, if you use the new Evil Sword and dump an Evil Tile into the graveyard, that doesn't really do much unless you have an Evil Tile and an Evil Sword in the graveyard while you have your set Evil Diversity. You see where I'm coming from with this. Without Evil Diversity, this deck completely falls apart. Without Evo Diversity, Xyz summoning in this deck is going to be an absolute chore, and therefore you wouldn't be able to summon your Evil Swords, Evil Czars all that well. And because this deck lacks any good level modulation, which honestly should have been a thing. I mean, Gagagas have better level modulation, especially that one Onomatopoeia card. It basically is a searcher and a level modulator, which is what Evols desperately need. Come on. They desperately need something like that. Also, this deck lacks more searchers because you only have 2 searchers, one of which actually searches when it destroys a monster by battle, so ew. And the other one is Evo Diversity, but Evo Diversity is not only a hard once per turn, but it's not really much of a searcher, especially like I mentioned. This deck desperately needs its evil swords to work with their evil tiles. So without either or, they kind of fall apart. So you gotta hope that you get your evil tiles to your hand. I was hoping we'd get another way to search the evil tiles and evil swords in the deck, but we never really got that with Konami. But they did give us a really cool evil sword to work with, so there's that. The new support is really great, but it doesn't really mean much since, the rest of the stuff you gotta work with is pretty trash. This deck is a bit slow because, like I mentioned, it's a very slow start. You kind of have to hope that you manage to open a hand that allows you to get out an evil czar onto the field, or multiple evil czars. And also going second is rough because this is more like a turn one deck. You have to go first. Going second is not pretty. Because not only are you losing the advantage of setting up a board of disruptions to disrupt your opponent's plays, but you're also going to have to deal with your opponent's end board. And even if they don't have disruption on the board to stop you from doing your evil swords and evil czar plays, they might summon a really big monster that your evil czars won't get over, which is one of the reasons why in my evil tile slash evil sword duels, you'll see me go for Doolittle Chimera first. Why? So I could get my evil tiles and evil swords into the graveyard so I can make use of Singularity. And the second most important reason is so I could buff my evil czars so they can beat over a good chunk of monsters in the game. The problem is when you have to deal with big monsters, because you can't really get over those all that well with evil czars. Also, like I mentioned, this deck is Singularity or Bust, because without Singularity, this deck is pretty unplayable. I'm not sure how people played Evols without Singularity in the past. And I'm not sure, yeah, like even, because I remember when Singularity first came out, it actually made this deck playable. And I tried playing this deck, like many years ago when Singularity came out, and I was like, wow, this deck would have been actually unplayable without Singularity, so I'm not really sure what Konami was thinking with this archetype. This archetype functions almost like Fire Fists in the sense that you need your Fire Formations and your Fire Fists in order to do things. It's like that, but worse with this deck, and Konami didn't really do a good job at fixing that all that well. At least give them like another searcher that also functions as level modulation. Anyways, for the stat, oh yeah, the new Evil Sword is level modulation, but it doesn't do it all that well. Anyways, for the stats, I'd give this deck a 2 out of 5 in power. For defense, a 2.5 out of 5. For recovery, a 1.5 out of 5, because if you fail to set up your board, or if you run out of resources, you're just going to be left top decking, and that's not really good. That's not really a good spot to be in, especially since, like I mentioned, you need both evil tiles and evil swords. And if you're top decking, you're just gonna draw one piece of the 3 pieces that you need. So it's not gonna be a good time. For versatility, I give this deck a 2 out of 5, and for consistency, a 3 out of 5. Overall, I'd say that this deck is a tier 3. The only reason I'm saying it's a tier 3 instead of a tier 3.5 is that this deck is fairly consistent, and you can still set up really good boards, but it's just going second that this deck is absolutely abysmal. Anyways, it's been me, your boy Blagetska, and tell me what you think about Batteryman and Evols, and I'm out.
Goodbye, Yugioh!